This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and I hope everyone is having a good Thursday. And before we get into today's show, I do want to hold on one second. Let me get a little organized here. Okay, before we get into today's show, I do want to remind you that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So if you're just tuning in, you're tuning into the One Human Nation show. And on this particular show, this is show 39, and it's going to focus on two different areas, with some specifics for Savannah, as well as some things I think that no matter what community you live in, what city you live in, there will be some takeaways for you for those particular these particular topics we're going to talk about. And for Savannah, it's a very emotional topic based on something that recently happened on this past Saturday at a funeral, which is already depressing because it's a funeral. It's already emotional. And at this funeral, there was an altercation where an innocent bystander, a 12-year-old boy, was shot. And so it brings to mind the question, and it was shot. There were two youth that were outside of the the funeral service that were I guess having some kind of altercation, and it escalated into gun violence, which seems to be an ongoing theme in many communities across our country. And it does have an impact in trying to get to the point of understanding and talking about having conversations in a safe, honest, open environment so that we can move towards reconciliation. And that's social justice, economic justice. I look at race reconciliation, and what kind of role does gun violence have to play in that? So the first half of the show is going to look at gun violence, the impact of gun violence, and some action items that people in Savannah can tap into and may or may not be aware of that I'm going to bring to your attention. And then the second half of the show ties into what's the role of education and access to quality education. Because they're linked together, especially when looking at gun violence as it is attached to youth committing violence in our communities. So the first clip we're going to listen to is, trying to find someone that's telling their story, and thank goodness for YouTube and TED Talks, but finding someone that's willing to share their story, which sharing your stories is very emotional and painful in many cases. And I did find this gentleman that shared his story of how he got involved in his community that was being inundated with gun violence. And this particular TED Talk was recorded, I think it was in 2015, and the person's name is Sherman Patterson, and you can actually Google Sherman Patterson on YouTube. Actually, the date of this TED Talk is October 1st, 2015. So I'm going to start it after he has, one tragic incident that he was pulled into because of his work. It appears that he was a liaison with the mayor's office in Minneapolis, and he got a phone call when he was at the movies with his wife to go to the hospital, that there had been a shooting and a child had been shot. And it turned out it was a 3-year-old. And this 3-year-old that had been shot was because of bullets that penetrated the house where this 3-year-old was living. And so this gentleman, Sherman Patterson, is talking about, his conversation with the parents, and they basically were telling him, what their protocol was when, shots were being heard in their neighborhood. And I never really even thought about that there's we think about a protocol for, if the fire alarm goes off, the smoke alarm goes off, what you should do in that case, or if there is bad weather and it's a hurricane or a tornado, where you should go to the safe place in your home. But to have a protocol for bullets coming through your house was something, it never even dawned on my consciousness that people live like this. And so the protocol for this family was to go upstairs to the second floor to the bathtub and get in the bathtub so they would be protected from the bullets. And 2 of the kids made it. They were a little bit older. The 3-year-old did not make it, was not quick enough, and consequently was shot, and he did die. And it was a very emotional impact for the person that's doing this TED Talk. But that wasn't the only thing. It was kind of like the start of, or an accumulation of things that kind of built up, that he got to his breaking point. So we're going to start with him talking about kind of his neighborhood and something else that happened that really just was kind of like the final straw for him. So let's take a listen and start learning today about gun violence and what we can do in our communities. And it may be that it's not exactly in your neighborhood, but as we're discovering in Savannah, as you wake up to where we are as a community, if it happens to one person in the community, it pretty much happens to all of us. So let's take a listen.
I live in North Minneapolis, a community that's thriving with small businesses, great people, artists, children. It's just a wonderful place. However, like many other major cities, we have our challenges. We are plagued with a cancer that's metastasizing through my community that's called gun violence. In 2004, I was reading on my front porch and I heard a loud bang. I looked up and I saw the ice cream truck stopped in the middle of the road, half a block away. I realized that the ice cream man had just been robbed and shot by a 12-year-old boy. That did it for me. I knew I had to get involved. My block had become the home of one of the most notorious young gangs in Minneapolis. Kids between the ages of 13 and 16 years old. 13 and 16 years old. I immediately went to the gang leader, a 15-year-old boy who lived on my block. And I asked him, "What's going on? How can I help you?" He looked at me with a menacing stare, very apprehensive, non-trusting. But every day I saw him, I would ask him the same question. Eventually, he warmed up to me. He saw that I was avuncular or approachable, genuine, and authentic. We began to share our stories, our life stories. We would sit down on my front steps in the middle of the street, and he would tell me how he felt hopeless, helpless. His fellow gang members, they thought adults had given up on them. The dysfunctionalism in the home, how they depended on each other. And these young boys is out on the streets shooting and killing other people and each other because they couldn't see any farther than where they were. I shared my story with him that I was from a broken home. My dad wasn't there. But I had two matriarchs. My 96-year-old grandmother, who's cognitive now, who holds me responsible and accountable when I call her. And I'll say, "Hi, girl, how you doing?" She said, "Boy, don't you call me girl." And my 72-year-old mom. But at the same time, I had anchors around me, anchors of men who held me accountable to be responsible. And they put that on their shoulders. And I told this gang leader that I am responsible for you, and I'm going to put you on my shoulders. Often I would pile a group of the gang guys in my vehicle, SUV, and we would go out and eat pizza outside of the gang territory. At times I knew I was putting myself at risk because a rival gang could come by and shoot up my vehicle, or even one of the kids could have a gun with them. I never asked. As we would ride, I noticed how they would light up, and like the sun's just shining on them, they became kids again. I would just listen and listen and listen about how they wanted to be teachers, poets, professional athletes, talking about graduating from school, just joshing with one another. This made me feel so good. Often on the return to Minneapolis and seeing the skyline, I could feel this dark cloud come over my car. They would morph back into these hardened gang members. You could see the stone faces in the car, the silence, the hopelessness coming back, feeling helpless, feeling boxed in.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we're looking at talking about and listening to stories about gun violence. And this particular person that's talking and sharing his story from a TED Talk, his name is Sherman Patterson, and he actually lives in Minneapolis. And this is from a TED Talk that he did in October of 2015. And I think what struck me as I listened to his story in reference to, the recent gun activity in Savannah at this funeral service. The other part of this funeral service was for a 20-year-old, that was shot by police officers as they were trying to serve him a warrant, from what I understand and what I've been reading. And he came to the door with a BB gun. Not a real gun, a BB gun. So there are several things that struck me when I heard this. I'm thinking, in what world does this black male think that was going to end well? And as I listened to this TED Talk from Sherman Patterson, because to me it was like suicide. And I'm thinking, you know what? He already knew the police officers were going to be coming for him because they were coming to serve a warrant for a homicide that they suspected him in. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe he knew that was his way, for want of a better way of thinking about it, or trying to get my head around it. That was the only way that that was his way out, because he no longer had hope. And that's the part of this story from this TED Talk that resonated with me. And as I started looking at information for Savannah, it was very interesting that there was kind of a code shift in the language that was used to talk about gun violence. Savannah, like many cities, had an issue, and still, in my opinion, has an issue with gang violence. And it seems like it escalated around 2000, and I don't have all of the timelines here. I was doing some research on it, but it was also something that was very concerning, because of course we have a huge tourist business, and that's kind of one of the major focuses on making sure that people that are also visiting the city feel safe. Now, the reality is, I don't think anyone that visits any city realizes that there is any such thing as a perfect utopia, that there are going to be areas that there are going to be that are poor economically, that there are going to be issues in. It's kind of universal. Unfortunately, that's the United States that we live in, and trying to whitewash that doesn't make it go away. So the coding that I started hearing, and we'll talk about this, is I don't hear the term gang violence anymore. I hear gun violence or youth violence, and I'm going to be sharing some statistics with you, and I want you to, I'll give you a date for Savannah where the mayor is actually conducting a State of the City address. February 12th at 6:30, and I'll remind you of that again. But let's listen to the remaining of this portion of the clip from Sherman Patterson as he talks about the gang violence in his neighborhood in Minneapolis.
Some are dead now from the years, several years have passed. Some are dead. Some have committed murders. Some are in prison. However, a few years ago, I saw one of those gang members, well, I say ex-gang members, because he was 13 at the time, and he came up to me and he said, "Thank you." He said, "Sherman, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being there for us, being there for me." Now he's working. He's taking classes in college. He's healthy. He's moving forward. But most of all, he told me that he's trying to help young kids and young men who are in his position, who was in his position. But don't get it twisted. My block is still challenged. I have little kids out playing outside all of the time now. They're happy. They're fulfilled with just joy. And when I come home, in my car, no matter how tired I am, I'm looking in my car, I see them playing outside and they're waiting for me to come. "Hey, Sherman." "Hey." I get out and I make sure I take the time, if it's just 2 minutes, to see how they're doing in school, what's going on in the house. And I'm always talking to the parent or guardian, because it's usually not parents. These are my kids on my block. I am responsible. Often people say, "Why don't you just move?" I can. But every time I see that smiling face, I'm anchored. As I said, we still have our challenges. Just this past Sunday, I came home, not even 20 feet into my yard. 10 gunshots rang off 4 houses from me. A young man had gotten shot. A young gang member had gotten shot. So we are still challenged with that behavior, drugs, the violence. And as I continue to reach out to these kids, to help them, to show them, and for them to be responsible, I continue to love them. But according to the Center for Disease Control, in 2013, homicides was the leading cause of death for African Americans between the ages of 15 and 34. The vast majority of those were caused by gun violence. Despite being only 14% of the population, African Americans in 2013 represented over 50% of gun violence deaths in America. In Minneapolis, this year, we've had 29 homicides. 22 of those homicides have been committed by gun violence. In a half-mile radius of my block, this year, we've had 2 murders committed by gun violence, over 20 people shot, and most of those are Black young men. I continue to mentor. I continue to reach out on my block, in my neighborhood, in the city. And this has afforded me the opportunity to create a program called Lead by Example Minneapolis. I have taken 10 young boys between the ages of 12 and 15, 6 from the Somali Cedar Riverside community, and 4 from North Minneapolis. 1 who lives across the street from me, and I've been mentoring him since he's been 9 years old. Our core focus is leadership, communications, health and nutrition, characters, and values. We meet once a month. We're sharing, we're bonding, we're taking field trips, but most of all, they're valuing themselves.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we're talking about gun violence, and that was a TED Talk from a person from Minneapolis. I would encourage you to listen to his entire TED Talk through the YouTube application that you can listen to the entire one. I kind of just wanted to focus on some of the portion that really was speaking to me based on some of this recent activity in Savannah. And, you know, I love Savannah. I think it is a wonderful city, and I definitely enjoy being back home. And as I started listening to more of the city council meetings and especially the work sessions, this is not the first time, obviously, that the whole topic of gun violence has come across my radar. And one of the things that came up in one of the work sessions that I thought was very interesting, and to me, as people become more and more awake in Savannah, as well as in other communities, this is something in reference to specifically Georgia, and in reference to what can happen to guns that are confiscated. So Georgia law enforcement agencies could, prior to 2012, destroy confiscated weapons. In 2012, there was a law passed requiring that the guns be auctioned off within 6 months when they cannot be returned to the owner and not needed as evidence. So they can no longer destroy these weapons. They had to sell them. And the rationale from the legislature, from the state legislature, of course, you know, they had their gun rights proponents saying, you know, the reason why we want those guns to be sold is it provides affordable weapons, a mechanism for people to be able to buy guns that are more affordable. Now, there's just something wrong with all of that. So what the city has done is that there was one program, a buyback program, and what they would do when they receive those guns back, they would just dismantle them. But recognize that the city did make the attempt in 2017 to have this law change for Savannah, and they didn't get anywhere with it. So for those of you that are in an activist mode, you may want to check back in and tune in to see, okay, is there something else to make another run through the legislature to have this change so that these guns can be destroyed? Because as I listened to one of the work sessions from City Council, a lot of the guns that are used in these activities are guns that have been stolen from people that leave their cars unlocked, and the gun is in the car and it's stolen, and it's in the streets in the hands of somebody that's not going to use it for a good intent. So if it was possible that when these guns are confiscated that they could actually be destroyed, would be a huge benefit in getting some of these guns off of the street. That's one thing I think that's huge as far as getting some legislation changed in what local law enforcement agencies can do when they know that they have a gun issue in their city. The other issue connected with this gun violence is when I looked at some of the shootings, and I mentioned the person that was shot, the funeral that was happening was for the person that was shot that actually had a BB gun, not a real gun. And then there's been other incidents of youth that have been shot. Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old that was shot in 2014 because he had a toy gun. And so what came out of this, and this was something that I came across from May 4th, 2017, that Cleveland's police union decided to sue the toy gun makers so that they would stop making the toy guns look so realistic. And they were approaching other cities so that other municipalities and the gun unions, the police unions would join force with them so that they can have more, critical mass to put more pressure on the toy manufacturers to stop making guns look so real. So I think that's another area to look at, is how to pressure these toy manufacturers. And of course, there's a huge lobbying on the other side for that not to happen. And so I'll let you do your own research to see the rationale behind that. To, in other words, get that market acclimated to holding a real gun. It's not that much stretch then to go from a toy gun to a real gun when it looks so authentic. So that was one thing, and the other that I noticed from listening to one of the most recent work sessions. I think this one was dated, February 1st. They were doing updates, and one of the updates that they were doing is the impact of tourism and the revenue that it generates for the city. And there was one council person that stated or asked the question, or actually it was a statement. It was a comment. And her comment was, this is great to get this update about tourism and what it means for the city of Savannah, but realize that there are neighborhoods that tourism doesn't impact their day-to-day lives, that they don't care anything about the tourist business because it doesn't make any change to what they're experiencing in their lives. And I don't know if this was the same one. I can't remember because, I watch these often. But there was a council member that also had mentioned at a different work session, that she's constantly, where she lives, it's constant gunfire. And I don't live in that part of Savannah where that's the norm. So there are segments and communities, neighborhoods in our city, in Savannah, that this is the norm for them. And so in order for us to get through a process of reconciliation, to get to social justice and economic justice, we have to really have some transparency in what's being done about gun violence. And I thought it was interesting in looking at some of the statistics. And I'm not going to go through a lot because I see our time is moving along. But I took a look, and what's been aggravating with me in looking at these statistics is it doesn't really break down how many of these activities involved youth. And so if you looked at the numbers for only the homicide numbers for Savannah, and you would need to go to the City of Savannah's website to pull down these statistics, and you kind of have to search for 2017. It's very easy to see the ones from 2007 to 2016, but they did note that for 2016, the homicide numbers was down from 53 in 2015 to 50 in 2016. And I had to dig to find out what the number was for 2017. And I'm going to see if I can get to that. And I think it was 53, but I'm going to have to do a little double checking on that. But I think the other part to really take a look at actually was the homicides for 2017 were down to 35. But I think the number that really stood out to me is the aggravated assault with gun. And so there are the statistics for that, and that actually increased in 2017 to 283 as opposed to 280. So one of the things, if you are in Savannah and you plan on attending the State of the City address on Monday, February 12th, is to be informed about what questions to ask, because I'm sure the information that's going to be presented from the mayor and from the city is going to present the rosy picture, and that's what they should do to keep calm, especially when there's been a violent incident, especially involving a youth, and it kind of brings up, okay, what are we really doing about the gun violence? But I think the other part of that is to also start asking some of the harder questions. You know, how is this connected to our youth, and how is this connected to gun violence? Instead of having these coded words that we're really not getting down to the issue of what's really impacting our city. So we're going to do a little shift, because this was the first part of the show that was focused on gun violence. We're going to do a shift because one of the other areas that definitely connected with our youth is access to quality education. And one of the things that really surprised me in moving back to Savannah, and I visited Savannah during the time that I wasn't living here, and this is over a period of 30 years, because my parents lived here, and I would go through the same neighborhoods that I would go through when I was going to school here, and things had totally changed. In the specific community that I'm referring to is Windsor Forest, which at the time that I was going to school there, it was predominantly white. And I went to Windsor Forest Elementary, went to Windsor Forest High School, and it was just a totally different environment. And now that's totally shifted, and that's connected to what happened in housing. But it also speaks to quality education and what's going on in our public schools that is impacting access to quality education for everyone. So before we get into that, I do want to make a couple of announcements, and then we're going to listen to some historical information on tracking, someone that's actually done the numbers to track the data on what's happened from the time that desegregation occurred in our public school system. So you're listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. The Savannah National Wildlife Refuge protects more than 29,000 acres of freshwater marshes, tidal rivers and creeks, and bottomland hardwoods along the Savannah River, supporting a diverse array of migratory and resident wildlife. Visitor activities including scenic wildlife drive, biking and hiking trails, and a free series of monthly speakers covering conversation and historical topics on the second Saturday of each month. For more information, visit fws.gov/Savannah. WRUU brings you the most diverse and passionate local radio programming on the air in Savannah. This all-volunteer and nonprofit community radio station accepts no money from any form of government. Our diversity and independence is made possible only through the generous financial support of listeners like you. We rely on your annual and ongoing monthly contributions to cover the many costs associated with bringing you our broadcast and web programming. If you are a contributor, thank you. If you're not yet a contributor, please show your appreciation of the role WRUU plays in your life by becoming a contributor in any amount. You can donate quickly and easily by credit card or check. Just find the donate and subscribe links at WRUU.org. wruu.org. Thanks for listening to and supporting WRUU. So you're listening to the One Human Nation show. This is show 39. And we're going to talk about access to public education, quality education, because since I don't have kids, I kind of have to live vicariously through asking people that have kids, okay, so tell me what's happened in this school district, because things are different from, when I attended. So what's going on? And it's been very interesting. So I realized, okay, I need to do some research to get up on this. And so I happened to find someone that had dedicated some very intense research. His name is Rucker Johnson, and looking at historical data. And he did a TED Talk. And if you want to really look at the slides and everything that he presented as part of this TED Talk, you would just go to YouTube and you can just search for Rucker Johnson. The impact of desegregation is as far as the topic, and his TED Talks are going to come up. So let's start with the first one, just to get acclimated to a little bit more about Rucker Johnson and what drove him to start looking at this data.
Be here. Good afternoon. I have always been fascinated with life stories. And even as a kid, I was the biography nerd, tearing through pages of Walter Payton and Wilma Rudolph and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Well, okay, so I was a sports geek too. But what jumped off the page as these athletes revealed their road to greatness, greatness isn't born, it's made. And so what I discovered is I needed to know what it was. What were the ingredients? What was the pathway, the process to greatness? And each story begins in childhood. But whether the road is rocky or smooth at the start, doesn't every child deserve the opportunity to write her own story of becoming great? And what role does our education system play in their story? Now, there's a most interesting narrative about a set of cohorts born in the 50s and 60s, school-aged children, that saw their outcomes get improved dramatically with one of the great social experiments of inclusion in our country, the implementation of school desegregation. And what I want to put forth is when we think about beginning a new school year and now approaching the 60th anniversary of the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision, I think it's fitting to reflect back on the efficacy of the various strategies that have been used to promote educational opportunity, equal educational opportunity. And when I look back over the last 4 decades, there have been 3 major government interventions that have dramatically influenced the provision of school resources and have substantially narrowed black-white differences in access to school quality. First among them, school desegregation. Second, school finance reform. And third is one of the focuses here, early child education programs and their expansion, for example, through Head Start. And when you look at those 3 strategies, one involves redistributing school children. The other involves redistributing money. One focuses on race. The other focuses on resources. Yet what's common about the approaches is their aim and goal to ensure access to school quality for the very disadvantaged children from preschool to K through 12. And a lot of research on inequality often suffers from a lack of sufficient historical analysis. For example, when you look at the black-white achievement gap, it narrowed substantially during the 70s and 80s, but it's been stagnant since. Today I want to put forth that an eye back can provide an eye forward into the possibilities of schools to be engines and vehicles to upward mobility. And so I want to inject a historical analysis of childhood conditions to trace the root of attainment differences by race and parental socioeconomic status.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we're talking about and listening and learning about, now the topic is about school desegregation, the impact that it's had, and kind of how that really ties into what's happened with the public school systems. I'm focused, of course, in Savannah, but really in a lot of communities around the nation. So let's continue to listen to some additional insight about this topic on school desegregation and how it, because now there's the data to show what the impact has been to changing the economics from people that were typically did not have access to quality education.
And it's worth mentioning at the outset that court-ordered school desegregation has been described as the most ambitious, and the results imply that school desegregation played the dominant role in narrowing black-white educational attainment for these cohorts. Now, one thing that you want to have in mind is that the 1960s was a miracle in policymaking, okay? So you not just had school desegregation, you had the desegregation of hospitals. You also had the Lyndon Johnson War on Poverty initiatives with Head Start, community health centers, expansion of food stamps. I mean, I could go on, but the point is that this analysis is taking all of those coincident policy expansions into account and their timing, which all independently have important effects. But these are isolating the effects of desegregation outside of those things, where you're looking at two individuals born in the same environment, same neighborhood, same school district. The only difference is that one grew up was born a little earlier, and so they went through a segregated environment for the more of their childhood years. And then we trace out the subsequent impacts, okay? Now, criminal involvement is, usually we focus on education outcomes, but what I want to make a point is that our best preventative antidote to criminal involvement is quality education, okay? And what you see here is when you look at outcomes like the likelihood of incarceration, again, no pre-existing time trend, but even in an era of the war on drugs happening later for these cohorts, you still see for this cohort a dramatic decline in the likelihood of incarceration with each additional year of exposure to desegregation. Similarly, when you look at career outcomes, by career outcomes I mean, think about it. Today, we normally reduce our evaluation of school systems by test scores. But if we had long-term outcomes, what would we like to use? We'd like to use labor market returns. We'd like to use your adult earnings, your success in the labor market, those kinds of outcomes. Well, we can do that with these data, right? So you look at occupational attainment. And again, no effects for whites, that is its level. It's not that their attainments aren't increasing secularly over time, but not associated with desegregation exposure, but for blacks, a significant narrowing of those occupational attainment gaps. And then when you look at adult earnings, again, dramatic increases that translate into an additional 5% in increase in annual earnings with each year of exposure to school desegregation, okay? No effects for whites. And that translates into substantial reductions in the annual incidence of adult poverty and other outcomes that are of interest. And even though I'm not going to present it today, we also see that this translates into significantly improved health, where individuals are 7 years younger than their counterparts are because of the school desegregation intervention. Now, the last set of pieces that I'll put to this puzzle is the legacy generation to generation. And here, all of these individuals are now in their 40s and 50s, and most of them have their own children. So we can link this now to what the educational and performance has been of the children of those cohorts born between 1948 and 68 who are born sometime after 1980, okay? And what you see is no effects for whites, but a significant increase in the performance for blacks. So in sum, I want to say that why these outcomes, resources or peer effects, what the research says is that it's the school resources that played the dominant role in explaining these patterns. That is, very minimal effects when the racial school segregation was accompanied by minimal changes in school quality. And so in sum, the story is not that a superior set of peers influenced the outcomes for bettering the outcomes of another set of peers, but rather that the keys of access open the door to resources, and that those keys should be securely placed in the hands of every child. And denying children access to those keys damages both their educational and later life outcomes. But when the doors of access are flung open and the rivers of opportunity flow to the resources that were once denied to those individuals, we see a great upswing in outcomes.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nations show. And so, in thinking about the whole school system, the public school system, which I went to public schools, but I went to public schools that look totally different from what the public school system looks now. And it was definitely became more integrated. And so one of the things that impressed me as I started learning more about the school systems and what has happened in the school system, and impressed may not be the best word, but it really struck me that as the economic condition for Blacks and Latinos improved, then these parents have a choice of what schools that they wanted their kids to go to. And so there was also the implementation of this voucher or school choice program that we're going to take a quick listen to learn more about that.
The vast majority of white children living in the city have access to a high-performing neighborhood school. The vast majority of Black students have guaranteed access to nothing.
Do you think we're betraying the legacy of Brown v. Board?
Absolutely. We have defied it in every way that you can.
America's schools are the most segregated they've been in almost 50 years. And for decades, the federal government hasn't been doing anything about it. Today's typical white student attends a school that is nearly 3/4 white. The average Black student goes to one that's almost entirely students of color. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education declared that segregated schools should be dismantled with, quote, all deliberate speed. We're sliding back into the two unequal systems Brown promised to get rid of, one for low-income Black and Latino students, and another for more affluent white and Asian students. I went to speak with John King Jr., the department's first Black and Latino Secretary of Education. Since being appointed in 2016, he's taken a firm stand in favor of integrating schools.
My teachers could have looked at me when I was a kid and said, here's an African American Latino male, family in crisis, going to New York City public school. What chance does he have? They could have written me off, but they didn't. They invested in me, and I want to make sure that all of our students have access to those opportunities.
Back when King was a student in the 1980s, schools were at their most diverse in history. Integration worked. In 1988, the achievement gap between Blacks and whites was half of its pre-Brown levels. No other education policy has ever come close to matching that success. So why'd we turn the other way?
There was significant progress in terms of creating schools that were more racially and socioeconomically diverse. But we have to acknowledge that there were other places where that didn't happen and where there was real resistance.
Parents didn't want Black and Latino kids coming to their schools.
They ain't gonna be in my grandson's class. Not here they ain't.
Some aggressively lobbied lawmakers and brought cases to the courts. Eventually, this resistance worked. Over the last 3 decades, school segregation has come back. The Department of Education was so discouraged that King's predecessors wouldn't even say the word desegregation for years.
The same blessing that saved my life, I want to make sure is available to more kids. Our challenge now is to approach this diversity work in a way that really lifts up voluntary, locally led efforts and accelerates those efforts.
King's plan isn't the forced busing of the past. Instead, he wants to make it easier for parents to send their kids to a school outside their neighborhood. This is called school choice. In this system, students of color can avoid bad neighborhood schools and apply for better ones across town, and white parents can choose to send their kids to more diverse schools than the ones nearby. The idea is that parents can voluntarily integrate schools. But it's not as easy as it sounds.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we're not going to have time to listen to the last clip, so I'll kind of do a little summary because I did some additional research on this school choice and found out it's a pretty complicated process. It typically involves a lottery, and so most parents that try it get frustrated, and you pretty much have to have the ability to go through all the complexities of the paperwork to even, navigate through the minutiae of what you need to do to even submit an application. So what typically happens, they make the choice of, okay, we're going to send our child to a private school, and they make the sacrifice to do that. Or they make the option, maybe homeschooling. And now, there's the option for grades 9 through 12, there's the option of online education. And so that doesn't really address the marginalized youth in our community that are not going to have that kind of support system, that are not going to have that anchor system in place. So what does that mean and what happens? And I think that's the dynamics of what Savannah is having to work through. And it's gotten a little bit complex because, of course, unfortunately, with everything, there seems to be politics involved. So the most recent thing that has happened in Savannah is that the school board president recently resigned, and there seems to be a disconnect of what's happening on the school board. And so the question is, that's a critical position for what's going to happen in your public school system, especially in Savannah, because that person has to work closely with the school superintendent. And there seems to be some kind of disconnect or discord with that. So it's going to be interesting to see. And this is, for those that are wondering, what can we do? This is a key position, and who's going to be elected into that position? I would encourage you to do your research. The election is coming up May 2018. So it'll be interesting to see what names are going into it, and that opportunity to have discussions and ask the questions to make sure that as this transition happens, that the kids that are most at risk are not going to be penalized. Well, believe it or not, we are coming up to the top of the hour. And as a reminder, you can now tune into the One Human Nation podcast. You can go to onehumannation.info to connect with that. I am going to be posting some of the clips for today's show, which is show 39, into the website for One Human Nation. That's onehumannation.info. If you have some additional information you would like to share with me, or if you would like to be on the One Human Nation show and share your stories as it relates to what we need to go through on the reconciliation process to become One Human Nation, you can email me at mystory@onehumannation.info. And as we get ready for the next show coming up, Sound Limit, Troy's not going to be here, so he's got a substitute, and good thing they told me that ahead of time, so I wouldn't be totally surprised. So John Bennett is substituting for Troy Stoner. So I do want to remind you again, there is going to be a State of the City address from Mayor Eddie DeLoach on Monday, February 12th at 6:30 at the Coastal Georgia Center. And I would highly recommend going to listen to that, asking some questions based on, what you're learning and what it's going to take for us to work through moving towards more social and economic justice in the city of Savannah. Thanks for listening to today's show, and I hope you have a fabulous week. Continue to take care of yourself. And the next week's show, I am going to do a follow-up to a show that was done on was show 30. So if you want to kind of prep for that, because I'm going to do a follow-up of what has happened in the whole arena of sexual assault, this kind of hashtag Me Too movement. There's been some activity going on in the local side in Savannah that involves the local victim service agency and what's going on with some of the dialogue around that, and unfortunately it doesn't seem to be for the betterment of the victims impacted. So do your homework, do your research, and I look forward to talking to you next week on the One Human Nation Show.